The morning of January 24th, 1943, somewhere between the Kasserine Pass and Tebessa in Tunisia, a German panzer reconnaissance unit had just overrun an American supply convoy, and among the scattered vehicles sat something their commander, Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, had heard about but never examined in detail. An American quarter-ton truck, a Jeep. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Weber ordered his men to secure the perimeter while he approached the vehicle. It was smaller than he expected, simpler, almost crude in its construction. The body panels were flat-stamped steel. The dashboard contained just a handful of instruments. No unnecessary flourishes, no excess weight, nothing that didn't serve a direct military purpose. He climbed behind the wheel and started the engine. It caught immediately despite the cold morning air and idled, with a steady mechanical rhythm. Weber pressed the clutch, shifted into first gear, and drove the Jeep in a slow circle around the captured convoy site. The steering was direct and responsive. The suspension absorbed the uneven desert terrain without complaint. The four-wheel drive system engaged with a simple lever mounted on the transfer case. What struck Weber most was not any single feature of the vehicle. It was the totality of its design. Every component served a function. Nothing was there for show or tradition. This was a machine built by people who understood that war required speed, reliability, and mass production above all else. Weber had commanded Kübelwagens for 2 years. He knew their strengths and their limitations. The Porsche-designed vehicles were lighter and more fuel-efficient than the American Jeep. In soft sand, they could keep pace with tracked vehicles by virtue of their low ground pressure and smooth underbody. But they lacked four-wheel drive. They had half the payload capacity. And they weren't designed for the kind of sustained abuse that modern mechanized warfare demanded. Weber ordered his men to load the Jeep onto a transport trailer. This vehicle needed to go back to headquarters for proper evaluation, not because it was some wonder weapon, but because it revealed something far more troubling about the enemy they were fighting. The Americans had solved a problem the Germans were still struggling with. How do you build a military vehicle that works everywhere, breaks down rarely, and can be manufactured by the tens of thousands? The answer sat in front of him, covered in North African dust. What Weber couldn't have known that morning was that his captured Jeep would become part of a systematic technical evaluation by the Wehrmacht's ordnance branch, and that evaluation would force German commanders to confront an uncomfortable truth. The Americans weren't just outproducing Germany, they were outthinking them. They had created a logistics system built on standardization and speed, while Germany clung to a philosophy of engineering excellence that was rapidly becoming a strategic liability. To understand why a simple utility vehicle could cause such concern among German military planners, you need to understand the context of German military logistics in 1943. The Wehrmacht had entered the war with a transportation system that was fundamentally pre-industrial. Despite the propaganda images of panzer columns racing across France, the reality was far less impressive. The typical German infantry division in 1941 relied on approximately 5,000 horses for transportation and artillery movement. Only a fraction of divisions were fully motorized, and even those used a chaotic mix of captured vehicles from across occupied Europe. French trucks, Belgian lorries, Czech automobiles, Polish cars. The German army had seized hundreds of thousands of vehicles during its conquests, and they pressed all of them into service. This created a maintenance nightmare. Each vehicle type required different spare parts, different tools, different training for mechanics. A motor pool might contain trucks from a dozen manufacturers, none of which shared common components. The Wehrmacht's own domestic truck production couldn't solve the problem. Germany entered the war with severe industrial limitations. The Nazi regime had prioritized rearmament, but they'd done so inefficiently. Instead of standardizing on a few vehicle designs that could be mass-produced, German manufacturers continued building dozens of different models. The result was that by 1943, the German military operated over 2,000 different vehicle types. Compare this to the American approach. When the United States entered the War Department made a calculated decision. They would standardize on a small number of vehicle designs and produce them in massive quantities. The Jeep, the 2.5-ton truck, the DUKW amphibious vehicle. These became the foundation of American military logistics. Every American soldier knew how to maintain a Jeep. Every motor pool stocked Jeep parts. Every mechanic could repair one in the field. This standardization created a multiplication of capability that the Germans simply couldn't match. The Jeep itself had been developed in a remarkable rush. In June 1940, the Army Quartermaster Corps issued a specification for a quarter-ton reconnaissance vehicle. They wanted four-wheel drive, a crew of 3, the ability to mount a .30 caliber machine gun, and they wanted it fast. The American Bantam Company submitted the first prototype in just 49 days. It was crude but functional. The Army then asked Willys Overland and Ford Motor Company to submit their own designs. What emerged from this competition was a vehicle that combined the best features of all 3 prototypes. Willys provided the powerful Go Devil engine. Bantam contributed the flat panel body design. Ford added manufacturing expertise. By July 1941, standardized production began. The Jeep that rolled off American assembly lines weighed 2,400 pounds. It had an 80-inch wheelbase and could carry a rated load of 800 pounds, though it regularly carried far more in combat conditions. The Go Devil engine displaced 134 cubic inches and produced 60 horsepower, enough to push the Jeep to a top speed of 65 miles per hour on paved roads. The four-wheel drive system gave it remarkable off-road capability. And critically, it was simple enough that field mechanics could keep it running with basic tools and improvised parts. German ordnance officers who examined captured Jeeps were forced to write reports that contradicted their professional instincts. The United States War Department Technical Manual TME 3045-1, Handbook on German Military Forces, published in March 1945, contains a revealing passage. It's actually a German assessment of the Volkswagen Kübelwagen, but it's written from the American perspective after examining captured German vehicles. The manual states that the Kübelwagen is inferior in every way to the Jeep, except in the comfort of its seating accommodations. But earlier German evaluations of captured Jeeps told a different story from the German point of view. In November 1943, the United States military conducted tests on captured Kübelwagens at Aberdeen Proving Ground. These tests showed that the German vehicle was lighter, more fuel-efficient, and actually faster on certain terrain. But the American evaluators noted critical weaknesses. The Kübelwagen lacked the payload capacity for heavy military use. It couldn't tow artillery pieces effectively. And its rear-wheel drive system, while adequate in ideal conditions, couldn't match the Jeep's four-wheel drive traction in mud, snow, or steep grades. The German evaluations of captured Jeeps reached similar conclusions in reverse. The Jeep was heavier and consumed more fuel, but it could do things the Kübelwagen couldn't. It could ford deeper water, it could climb steeper hills, it could haul heavier loads, and most importantly, it appeared to be nearly indestructible. German mechanics who examined captured Jeeps found that the vehicles continued operating even after sustaining damage that would have disabled a Kübelwagen. American soldiers had a saying that became legendary: a Jeep would go anywhere a mule could go, and it wouldn't balk at bad judgment. After the war ended, United States Army historian Hugh Cole interviewed Wehrmacht generals about their experiences fighting American forces. He asked them what weapon or piece of equipment they'd found most impressive in the American arsenal. The answers were revealing. They didn't cite the Sherman tank. They didn't mention American artillery. They talked about the Jeep. The German generals told Cole that they admired the Jeep more than anything else the Americans had fielded. This wasn't empty praise. Every German unit that captured a Jeep kept it. Sometimes they painted German markings on the vehicle and used it immediately. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. More often, they sent it to the rear for evaluation and eventual distribution to units that desperately needed transportation. The Wehrmacht was chronically short of vehicles throughout the war, and captured Jeeps helped fill that gap. By 1944, It was common to see German reconnaissance units operating American jeeps alongside their own Kubelwagens. Otto Skorzeny, the SS commando who led Operation Greif during the Battle of the Bulge, specifically requested jeeps for his mission. The operation called for English-speaking Germans to penetrate American lines wearing captured uniforms and driving captured vehicles. Skorzeny believed that jeeps were so common in American rear areas that his men could blend in easily. The operation failed for multiple reasons, but Skorzeny's choice of the jeep as the ideal infiltration vehicle said something about how ubiquitous it had become. German soldiers had come to believe that every American was issued his own jeep. This was obviously not true, but it reflected how thoroughly motorized American logistics appeared to German troops who often moved on foot or with horse-drawn wagons. The strategic implications of this disparity became clear during the Allied breakout from Normandy in July and August 1944. After weeks of grinding attritional combat in the Norman hedgerows, American forces achieved a breakthrough at St. Lo. General Omar Bradley's Operation Cobra shattered German defensive lines, and suddenly American armored columns were racing across France. The Red Ball Express, an around-the-clock trucking operation, kept supplies flowing to the advancing units. Thousands of trucks drove one-way loops from Normandy beaches to forward supply dumps, then back empty to reload. The Germans couldn't match this tempo. Their logistics system, built on railways and horse-drawn transport, couldn't keep pace with a rapidly moving front. German units that tried to retreat found themselves outrun by American mechanized columns. Units that tried to counterattack ran out of fuel before reaching their objectives. The vaunted panzer divisions, which had terrorized Europe in 1940 and 1941, were increasingly immobilized not by enemy fire but by empty fuel tanks. By September 1944, American forces had advanced 500 miles from the Normandy beaches. They'd liberated Paris. They'd reached the German border in some sectors, and they'd done it in less than 3 months. The Germans called this kind of rapid mechanized warfare Blitzkrieg, lightning war. But by 1944, it was the Americans who'd truly mastered the concept. Not through superior tanks or better tactics, but through superior logistics. The simple truth was that American forces could move faster because they had more vehicles. And those vehicles, particularly the Jeep, worked. A German intelligence report from September 1944, captured after the war, contained a revealing passage. The report analyzed American logistics capabilities and concluded that American forces enjoyed a 3-to-1 advantage in operational mobility compared to equivalent German units. The report attributed this advantage primarily to the number and reliability of American vehicles, especially light trucks like the Jeep. The report's author noted that American infantry divisions possessed organic transportation capability that allowed them to move and resupply themselves far more rapidly than German divisions of similar size. This wasn't just a theoretical observation. In practical terms, it meant that American units could advance, engage the enemy, and then continue advancing while German units had to pause to allow their supply trains to catch up. This difference in operational tempo gave American forces an enormous advantage. They could concentrate forces more quickly, they could exploit breakthroughs more effectively, and they could keep German forces off balance by maintaining constant pressure. The Jeep didn't win the war by itself. No single piece of equipment ever does. But it enabled a style of warfare that the Germans couldn't match. American forces fought what the Germans called Materialschlacht. Material battle, a contest of industrial production and logistical support rather than traditional military skill, and in that contest, the side with more jeeps, more trucks, and more ability to move supplies won. The crisis of German logistics reached its breaking point during the Ardennes offensive in December 1944. Hitler had ordered a massive counterattack through the Belgian forests, hoping to split Allied forces and capture the port of Antwerp. On paper, the plan was ambitious but achievable. The Germans assembled 3 armies totaling over 400,000 men, supported by hundreds of tanks and assault guns. They had the element of surprise. They had veteran troops. What they didn't have was enough fuel. German planning for the offensive assumed they would capture American fuel depots during the advance. This was not strategy, it was desperation. The Wehrmacht's logistical system could barely deliver enough fuel to get the panzers to their jump-off positions. Once the attack began, German armoured units would have to seize American supplies or grind to a halt. This wasn't blitzkrieg, it was a gamble built on hope rather than planning. The attack began on December 16th. German forces achieved tactical surprise and made significant initial gains. But within days, the offensive began to falter. German tank columns ran out of fuel kilometers short of their objectives. Artillery units couldn't move forward because the horse-drawn, supply wagons couldn't keep pace with the armoured spearheads. Infantry divisions, forced to march on foot through winter weather, arrived at the front, exhausted and under strength. Meanwhile, American forces demonstrated exactly the kind of logistical flexibility that German commanders had come to fear. Within 48 hours of the initial German attack, American truck convoys were redirecting thousands of tons of supplies to threatened sectors. The 101st Airborne Division was loaded onto trucks and rushed to defend the critical road junction at Bastogne. Artillery battalions displaced their guns, loaded them on trucks, and moved to new positions in a matter of hours. The entire Allied logistics apparatus pivoted to meet the threat with a speed that would have been impossible without massive numbers of reliable vehicles. By early January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was effectively over. The German offensive had failed not because of any single tactical defeat, but because the Wehrmacht simply couldn't sustain the operation. They ran out of fuel, they ran out of ammunition, they ran out of time. American forces, by contrast, never experienced critical supply shortages. The trucks kept rolling, the jeeps kept running. The logistics system that German commanders had studied with growing dread proved unbreakable. After the war, American interrogators asked German General Hasso von Manteuffel about the Ardennes offensive. Von Manteuffel commanded the 5th Panzer Army during the attack and had fought American forces across France and into Germany. His assessment was brutally honest. The offensive failed, he said, because German logistics couldn't support the operational plan. American forces could move faster, concentrate faster, and resupply faster, and that advantage stemmed directly from their motorized transport system. The technical evaluations that German ordnance officers produced after examining captured jeeps told part of the story. The jeep was a good vehicle, reliable, versatile, well designed for military use. But the deeper story wasn't about the jeep's technical specifications, it was about what the jeep represented, a completely different approach to military logistics and industrial production. German military culture valued engineering excellence and technical sophistication. German tanks were arguably the best in the world in terms of firepower and armor protection. German machine guns were superbly engineered, German optics were unmatched. But this obsession with quality came at a cost. German weapons were often over-engineered, difficult to manufacture, and impossible to maintain in field conditions. But it required constant maintenance and specialized parts that frequently weren't available. American military culture valued different things: reliability over performance, quantity over quality, standardization over optimization. The Sherman tank wasn't as good as a Panther in a one-on-one fight. But for every Panther that Germany produced, America built 5 Shermans, and those Shermans were simple enough that field mechanics could keep them running with basic tools. The same philosophy applied to the Jeep. It wasn't the best possible reconnaissance vehicle, it was the best vehicle that could be produced in massive quantities and kept running under terrible conditions. This difference in philosophy extended beyond individual vehicles to entire logistics systems. The United States entered World War II with enormous industrial capacity but limited military experience. American planners made a conscious decision to leverage that industrial strength by creating a logistics system based on abundance. They would build so many trucks, so many jeeps, so many transport ships, that supply would never be the limiting factor in military operations. This required discipline and central planning. The War Production Board allocated resources. The Ordnance Department standardized specifications. The motor companies retooled their factories and began mass production on a scale the world had never seen. By 1943, American factories were producing a completed Jeep every 2 minutes. Willys Overland and Ford Motor Company together built over 640,000 Jeeps during the war. This represented about 18% of all wheeled military vehicles the United States manufactured. Each Jeep cost the government approximately $950. For less than $1,000 per unit, the American military got a vehicle that could haul supplies, tow artillery, carry wounded soldiers, mount weapons, and operate in any climate on Earth. Germany never achieved anything close to this level of standardized mass production. The Wehrmacht operated over 2,000 different vehicle types throughout the war. Some were excellent designs. The Opel Blitz truck was reliable and well regarded. The SD, KFZ, reconnaissance vehicles were highly capable. But the diversity of designs meant that German logistics remained fragmented and inefficient. A motor pool in France needed different spare parts than a motor pool in Russia. A mechanic trained on Mercedes trucks couldn't easily repair a captured French Citroën. The system worked when Germany controlled most of Europe and could requisition vehicles and parts from occupied factories. But as Germany lost territory and factories were destroyed by bombing, the system collapsed. The irony was that German engineers understood these problems. Numerous reports from Wehrmacht ordnance officers recommended standardization and simplified designs, but institutional inertia and political factors prevented meaningful reform. German manufacturers resisted standardization because it threatened their individual design, traditions, and company identities. Nazi Party officials interfered with production planning for ideological reasons, and Hitler himself frequently demanded design changes that disrupted production schedules. The contrast became stark in the final year of the war. As Allied forces advanced into Germany from both east and west, German logistics completely broke down. Units that should have been motorized were reduced to using bicycles and handcarts. Panzer divisions abandoned functioning tanks because they had no fuel to move them. Supply trains that once ran on strict schedules simply stopped operating. The Wehrmacht, which had pioneered modern mechanized warfare in 1939 and 1940, finished the war as a largely immobile force. American forces, meanwhile, maintained their operational tempo all the way to the Elbe River. The Red Ball Express expanded into a massive network of supply routes. Motor transport companies operated 24 hours a day, moving everything from ammunition to typewriters. Frontline units received regular deliveries of fuel, food, and spare parts. The logistics system that German commanders had studied with mixture of admiration and despair proved capable of sustaining multi-million-man armies across hundreds of miles of liberated territory. The ultimate vindication of American logistics philosophy came in the final months of the war. As Allied forces crossed the Rhine and advanced into Germany, they discovered that speed mattered more than careful planning. Units that could move quickly could exploit German disorganization. Units that had to wait for supplies gave the Germans time to establish new defensive positions. American commanders learned to prioritize mobility over firepower. Better to have medium tanks that kept moving than heavy tanks that stopped for maintenance. Better to have jeeps that ran than half-tracks that didn't. This represented a fundamental shift in military thinking. For centuries, armies had moved at the speed of marching infantry. Railroads in the 19th century increased strategic mobility but didn't change the basic tactical picture. Motor vehicles in World War I supplemented rail transport but couldn't replace it. World War II was the first conflict where motor vehicles became the foundation of military logistics, and the military that understood this reality first gained an enormous advantage. The Germans had actually pioneered many of these concepts in the 1930s. German military theorists like Heinz Guderian had advocated for mechanized combined arms tactics. The stunning German victories in Poland and France demonstrated what motor vehicles could achieve when properly employed. But Germany never built the industrial base to fully exploit these ideas. They created panzer divisions that could break through enemy lines, but they couldn't build the logistics system to keep those divisions supplied during extended operations. The Soviet Union and the United States learned from German successes and German failures. The Soviets received over 400,000 American trucks through Lend-Lease, including tens of thousands of Studebaker US-6 trucks that became the backbone of Red Army logistics. Soviet commanders understood that they couldn't match German tactical skill, but they could match German operational tempo if they had enough vehicles. American trucks gave them that capability. By 1944, Soviet offensive operations demonstrated the same characteristics as American operations: rapid advances, deep penetrations, relentless pressure that never gave the enemy time to reorganize. The Germans found themselves caught between two logistics juggernauts. In the east, Soviet forces advanced behind a wall of American-supplied trucks. In the west, American and British forces operated with what seemed like unlimited motor transport. German commanders who had once dismissed logistics as a mundane technical concern now understood that it was the decisive factor in modern warfare. You couldn't fight if you couldn't move. You couldn't move without vehicles. And you couldn't maintain vehicles without a standardized, mass-produced logistics system. The captured Jeep that Hauptmann Weber had sent back to German headquarters in January 1943 became one small piece of evidence in a much larger realization. The Americans weren't winning because they had better soldiers or better generals. They were winning because they had solved the logistics problem. They'd built an industrial system that could produce weapons faster than Germany could destroy them. They'd created a logistics network that could move those weapons to the front faster than Germany could establish new defensive lines. And they'd done it with vehicles like the Jeep that were simple, reliable, and manufactured in overwhelming numbers. German technical reports on captured Jeeps contained detailed specifications: engine displacement, gear ratios, suspension characteristics. But the numbers didn't capture what really mattered. The Jeep worked. It kept working. And there were hundreds of thousands of them. This combination of reliability and abundance created a military advantage that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. By May 1945, when Germany surrendered, the evidence was overwhelming. The United States had produced over 363,000 Jeeps for itself and its allies. Germany had produced about 51,000 Kübelwagens for its entire military. The disparity in total vehicle production was even more striking. America built nearly 3 million military trucks during the war. Germany built approximately 345,000. This 10-to-1 advantage in vehicle production translated directly into a similar advantage in operational mobility. The post-war interrogations of German officers revealed how completely this disparity had dominated their thinking in the final years of the war. German commanders knew they couldn't match American logistics. They couldn't move as fast. They couldn't concentrate forces as quickly. They couldn't sustain offensive operations as long. Every operational plan had to account for these limitations. And increasingly, those limitations made victory impossible no matter how clever the tactical planning might be. General Dwight Eisenhower, who commanded Allied forces in Europe, later wrote that the Jeep was one of the 4 pieces of equipment most vital to Allied success. The other 3 were the bulldozer, the 2.5-ton truck, and the C-47 transport aircraft. All 4 items on Eisenhower's list were logistics tools, not combat weapons. This wasn't an accident. Eisenhower understood, perhaps better than any other senior Allied commander, that modern warfare was ultimately about logistics. The side that could move more supplies faster would win. The side with better vehicles would move supplies faster. Therefore, the side with better vehicles would win. The Jeep became the symbol of American logistics. Dominance not because it was a particularly sophisticated machine, but precisely because it wasn't. It was a simple tool that worked reliably in the hands of ordinary soldiers. It required no special training. It broke down rarely. When it did break down, it could be repaired with basic tools and improvised parts. And most importantly, there were enough of them that losing a few to enemy action or mechanical failure didn't matter. The system as a whole kept functioning. This redundancy through abundance was alien to German military culture. German officers were trained to make the most of limited resources. They planned operations around careful husbanding of supplies. They treated vehicles as precious assets that needed protection. American commanders operated under completely different assumptions. Vehicles were expendable. Supplies were unlimited. If you needed more, you requested more, and the logistics system would deliver. This mindset enabled aggressive operations that German commanders simply couldn't match. The contrast played out in countless small ways throughout the campaign in Western Europe. American units would take casualties and immediately receive replacements. German units took casualties and waited weeks for reinforcements that often never arrived. American tanks that broke down were either repaired quickly or replaced with new vehicles from depot stocks. German tanks that broke down were often abandoned because there were no spare parts or recovery vehicles available. American artillery units fired ammunition freely because they knew resupply was certain. German artillery units carefully rationed ammunition because resupply was uncertain at best. These differences accumulated over time into decisive advantages. By 1944, American infantry divisions could sustain offensive operations longer than German divisions of similar size. American armored divisions could advance further before needing to pause for refueling. American air units could fly more sorties because ground crews had the vehicles and equipment needed to maintain aircraft at high operational tempo. None of these advantages came from superior courage or better tactical training. They came from logistics. And logistics came from vehicles. And vehicles came from industrial production capacity. And production capacity came from standardized designs that could be manufactured efficiently. The Jeep was the physical manifestation of this entire logic chain. Every time a German soldier saw a captured American Jeep, he was seeing evidence of an industrial system that Germany couldn't match. Every time a German commander read a report about American logistics capabilities, he was reading about a problem that had no military solution. You couldn't outflank a logistics system. You couldn't destroy enough trucks to make a difference when the enemy could build replacements faster than you could destroy them. The only way to defeat American logistics was to destroy American factories. And by 1943, that was impossible. The strategic bombing campaign that Germany endured from 1943 onward gradually dismantled what remained of German industrial capacity. But even before the bombing became truly devastating, Germany had already lost the production war. American factories in 1942 alone produced more vehicles than Germany would produce during the entire war. The gap only widened as American production accelerated and German production declined. Some German officers understood this reality as early as 1942. They recognized that Germany was fighting an enemy with effectively unlimited resources. They knew the war was unwinnable under these conditions. But the Nazi political system didn't allow for honest strategic assessments. Officers who suggested that Germany couldn't win were removed from command, or worse. So the war continued, and German forces fought with decreasing effectiveness as their logistics system gradually collapsed. The Jeep that Hauptmann Weber captured in Tunisia in January 1943 continued its journey through the German logistics system. It was evaluated at a testing facility in Bavaria. Engineers measured its performance characteristics. They examined its construction methods. They wrote detailed reports analyzing its strengths and weaknesses. And then those reports joined thousands of other documents in Wehrmacht archives, where they were largely ignored because the conclusions were too unpleasant to accept. Germany couldn't build vehicles like the Jeep because Germany didn't have the industrial capacity, the raw materials, or the political stability to implement the necessary reforms. The Wehrmacht would continue using its chaotic mix of vehicles until the end of the war. German soldiers would continue admiring captured Jeeps and trying to keep them running as long as possible. And German commanders would continue writing operational plans that assumed logistics capabilities that simply didn't exist. The story of the Jeep in World War II isn't really a story about a vehicle. It's a story about two different approaches to industrial warfare. Germany pursued excellence in individual weapons, while neglecting the logistics system needed to support those weapons in sustained combat. The United States pursued adequacy in individual weapons, while building a logistics system of overwhelming capacity. In 1939, the German approach appeared superior. By 1945, the American approach had proven decisive. The captured German soldier, who remarked that Americans had piled up the supplies and then let them fall, on German forces understood this reality. So did the Wehrmacht generals who told Hugh Cole that they admired the Jeep more than any other American weapon. They recognized, too late, that wars aren't won by the side with the best tanks or the best infantry tactics. Wars are won by the side that can keep its forces supplied, mobile, and operational. And in World War II, that meant the side with the most trucks. The Jeep enabled American forces to move 3 times faster than equivalent German units, not because it was 3 times faster in terms of top speed, but because it was 3 times more reliable, 3 times more common, and supported by a logistics system 3 times more capable. This multiplication of effects turned a simple utility vehicle into a strategic weapon. The Germans examined captured Jeeps and understood, finally, why they were losing. The Americans could simply outmove them, and in mobile warfare, the side that moves faster wins. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.